Hi, this is a presentation on using the new MySQL Shell with Python. And I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Dave Stokes. I'm a community manager. I've been on the MySQL community team for just over a decade, using MySQL since it first came out. And this will hopefully be a quick introduction to the MySQL Shell and how to extend it with Python. Safe harbor statement, I work for Oracle. During the course of this presentation, I'm talking about the free open source version of MySQL and the MySQL Shell, all out there under the GPL. However, in Q&A, I might very often some new functionality coming in future releases, since I don't have perfect knowledge of those perfect releases, and what I know is probably wrong. Take anything I say about a future release with a grain of salt. So, about me, once again, I'm on the MySQL community team. I live in Texas. The slides are going to be available at slideshare.net/Dave Stokes. I got a blog at elephantdolphin.blogspot.com. If you need to get a hold of me, I'm at Stoker on Twitter or david.stokes@oracle.com. So, what is the new MySQL Shell? Well, if you used our old interface, anything before 8.0, it was a simple command line editor. The new shell is much more advanced in that it allows you to process queries in structured query language. Big surprise there, eh? Also, there's a JavaScript mode and a Python mode. So between these three modes, you've got a lot of flexibility. And by the way, if you have something that's written in Python, you can run it in JavaScript mode, and JavaScript mode stuff can run in Python. So if you haven't seen our new shell, it's no longer monochromatic. When you fire it up, it of course gives you the copyright. And if you notice here, this yellow stuff here says JS for JavaScript. Well, what if you don't like JavaScript and you want to use Python? /py moves you into Python mode. And if you're an old timer like me and you want SQL, there you go. You can run SQL. By the way, you can run SQL code from Python or JavaScript mode as you wish. Now, once you log in, if you do a \S for status, or you can do a session.get status, there's some things here I'd like to point out to you. First thing, if you can see my mouse here, is by default, we're secure. We're using SSL with TLS AES 256 by default. If you don't need it, you can turn it off, but by default, we want to give that to you. Also, our default character set now is UTF-8MB4. That's to help get all four planes of the 9.0 Unicode standard, which means, yes, you do get emojis. Yay. And by the way, if you notice down here, compression. If you need to compress stuff, that helps a lot. It's on by default. So with the new shell, you have two types of sessions. The classic, which is our old port 3306. We've had that for 25 years. Yes, MySQL is 25-year-old. And we also have another port, 33060, for the new X DevAPI, which is designed to handle both SQL traffic and NoSQL traffic. You can use MySQL as a NoSQL JSON document store. By the way, you can reach the JSON stuff from the classic side and the classic stuff from the NoSQL side, trying to give you more flexibility. Now, the reason we're here today is I want to talk about the functions. If you write functions or programs or scripts or whatever you want to call it in either JavaScript or Python, and you find them handy, you can actually run them under different sessions. So you can have one session running JavaScript, two more running Python, run all sorts of reports and all that. Now, to log in, you can either type in MySQL Shell, root at localhost or whatever thing, or once you get the shell fired up, you can do a \C for connect, and you log in. Or once you get fired up, you can have multiple sessions. Now, this example is in JavaScript where we're having session 1, which we say we're going to do a classic session, which will port to 3306, account name and password. Now, if I want a second session to generate data and feed it to the first session, no problem there. Oh, by the way, if you want encryption, you can specify how you want it, where you want your definitions for all this stuff. In this example, we're accepting TLS 1.1 and 1.2. Well, by default, compression is turned on, but if you want to specify your algorithms like LZ4 or Z standard and the level of compression, you can do that. Also, something we can offer for you is JSON schema validation. JSON, by default, is very loosey-goosey. There's no rear on there. Traditional relational databases is very tightly structured. One thing we do, thanks to the wonderful, wonderful people at jasonschema.org, is we can set up an exemplar template that we test your incoming JSON documents against. And we can say, hey, we have this required field, and the values, it takes numbers, and the minimum value is -90, the maximum number 90, maximum is +90. So you can set up required fields, range check, and type checks. Very, very handy. By the way, first time you log in using the MySQL Shell, it will ask you if you want to store your password. That is hashed very securely. So if you don't want to keep typing your password, that will do that work for you too. By the way, if you have some code in Python, you can just pipe it to the shell and away it will go. Make sure you're in Python mode, of course. By the way, if you have libraries you like this example, I'm using datetime. I import the datetime library and I get full access to that. So if you have libraries you like to work with your data with, it's all there for you. Also, if you're using our new X DevAPI as a NoSQL document store, the MySQL no longer requires you to actually go out and use SQL if you don't want to. You'll find this is a very straightforward API. On our system, we're connected to a database called WorldX. It has a document collection. We've typed to get collection. It'll tell you that name of that collection is country info. So the current database pointer to that collection, we're going to find all the records that have a name like a parameter, and we bind uppercase S wildcard to that parameter, and we're going to limit to one. So our new API is very straightforward, very easy to use, very similar between all three languages. It also supports in our other various connectors, very easy to use. Once again, if you don't like SQL, you do MySQL without SQL. By the way, I'm going to repeat that. You find out your collections, go out and run your query. By the way, it is not an ORM. It is actually a totally clean sheet protocol written on Google Protobufs. Really nice design. And by the way, it has a lot of smarts put in there, so it gets rid of things like most SQL injection. Okay, here's another thing. I'm logged in. I'm in Python mode. For my current session, I'm going to run _SQL on just a straight query. So that would be the same as going out to the SQL mode and running the same query. By the way, if you notice, this is out in a table output. If you want to do it in JSON, you tell your shell, hey, my resort format is going to be JSON. And out it comes in JSON. Very, very handy. By the way, I mentioned earlier, you don't need to use SQL. Say like you have a project where your bosses tell you, hey, go ahead and start coding. We'll tell you what you're actually doing next week. It's real easy to go out there and create a document collection. And in there, we're going to add a record. And haven't had to go out and set up relations, had to set up indexes. I'm able to just store data right off the bat. Now, if I do a db.openjs, the collection we create up here, add in a record, you'll notice that when I do the find command that it gives you an underscore ID. This is the value you can specify or have the server generate it for you. This is actually a primary key for the DB storage engine. Very important, but I'm not going to go off into that. So if you have JavaScript libraries, this is an example of JavaScript libraries. If I type in the libraries, require a file, if I do Dave tab, it shows me the two functions we have defined over here, and I can run them at will. That's about the same thing for JavaScript. Now, you can define your own extensions to the base functionality of the shell in forms of reports and extensions. Now, these can be created once again in JavaScript or Python, and they're accessible from either of those languages. You can persist these, you can watch them, have them run over and over again, and they are automatically loaded every time the shell starts. Now, here's an interesting example. We're going to define a quick little extension in Python. And the trick down here is we create a function, this one I'm just going to call show tables, and we have to make sure that we have a session. You have to be logged into the database to actually get access to the tables. So if you don't have a session, it kind of tells you where to go. So if you do have a session, it's basically going to run _SQL, select from world.city, and then dump out the results. Now the trick is to register to the shell is we have to have a plugin object, and we create an extension for that. And for that plugin object that we have here, we give it the name of our function, what we want to call it, and a little bit of help information. As you can see there in, a dozen lines of code, very easy to set up a basic little query. So once again, make sure we have a session. And once we have a session, we can run queries all day long. Now, as I mentioned before, all we have to do is register the plugin object with our function, and easy peasy. Now, reports are a little bit different. You can register a report that you define in Python or JavaScript. The reporting facility handles building reports, and there's a whole bunch of them out there already for you. And reports can specify a list of report-specific options. If you want to have a -v for verbose, -z for compress, however you want to do it. And you can have all sorts of inputs. So it actually read from the screen. Now, Instead of registering a plugin, it's register report. Otherwise, it's pretty much like you've seen earlier. You can write your own reports. This is one where it goes out there and watches the sessions. I believe this one's actually built into the new shell. And when you run it, it tells you, I'm running this with a /watch sessions, which is the name of our report, and it runs every 2 seconds. When it's the built-in reports, you can set up intervals, you can set up global statuses to watch, you can run things in foreground, background, however you want to do it. Now, the shell by default also has some utilities for those of you who deal with a lot of data. One very important one is import JSON. So if you have a lot of JSON, it's very easy to use. You say util.import JSON, the name of the file, what schema or database you're loading into, and what you want to call the collection. This works with the latest version of the shell. Also, for those of you who are on 5.7 wanting to go to 8.0, we have a util check for server upgrade. This will go out there and make sure that you're not using reserved words. We have several new reserved words in 8.0. Also, make sure that you're not going to run into any problems like converting over to UTF-8 and before. Also, we can have utilities for importing tables. We have a lot of interesting stuff off the import table. If you've been playing with MySQL dump for years and years, are looking for something a little bit faster, we have export table, and that's a very fast way to dump your data. And we also have the ability to dump in the entire instance. So if you want everything on the server, you can do that. If you want to test to see how long it's going to run, you can do that. If you're using the Oracle Cloud, there's some functionality you can do there for setting up buckets and all that. If you want to dump tables, you can just say, okay, from this schema, I want these 2 tables. Very interesting and fun. Now, if you want to learn more about all this, the MySQL Shell is actually fairly well documented, and there's lots of examples on writing plugins. This one, developpaper.com, is a very good starting place. My counterpart from Belgium has a lot of interesting blogs about how to do that. Also, he has a GitHub library of a whole bunch of shell plugins that are very, very nice. Very, very handy. Things like that you copy users, check NODB status, and all other stuff. And before I go, I'd like to say, hey, if you want to run the MySQL Shell under our new MySQL database service, if you go to this location, you can get $300 in credits. This is quite a lot of time, a month or 2, if you stay to the low-end engines, for free to go out there and test the MySQL service. By the way, this is the full enterprise version of MySQL 8, and it is the latest and greatest, and it is monitored and supported by MySQL engineers. Also, if you're a member of the MySQL community, congratulations, you're now a member of the MySQL community. Please join us on mysqlcommunity.slack. We're on mysql.com, under Twitter we're MySQL, Facebook we're MySQL, and LinkedIn we're under MySQL. By the way, if you are a startup and startups only, you can enroll at oracle.com/startup to get a whole bunch of cloud credits, a whole bunch of help with other areas, exposure with marketing, some good stuff if you want to do some events, because events are coming back, thank goodness. This is a great thing if you are a startup, because Oracle really wants to get you off the ground. And by the way, if you're using a lot of JSON with MySQL, please buy a copy of my book. This is the 2nd edition. First edition came out 3 years ago. We keep adding new features, so 2nd edition was new. This is for folks who want to learn how to use JSON with a database. Our manual is good, but it's a reference guide, not a coding example. And this is how you do it in best practices guide. Available on Amazon today. And with that, we're going to go into Q&A. And I want to thank you for your time.